Hello everyone, welcome to my Resident Evil Revelations 2 Survival Difficulty, No Healing Walkthrough. This is Barry 1, and Barry 1 is an easy chapter, and I took damage in a couple of areas because I have my flashlight on. So Barry has access to a flashlight, but it doesn't work the same way as Moira's flashlight. His flashlight just allows him to illuminate the surroundings, but I think the enemies have the ability to see Barry's flashlight when it's on, because I noticed a couple of moments where I'm trying to sneak attack revenants, but they just turn around. And when I was looking back at the recording, my flashlight was on, and Natalia wasn't around, so it wasn't her sprinting. I think Barry's flashlight can actually be noticed by the enemies, so that was my mistake. But I didn't bother restarting, given that this is a no healing walkthrough, and I didn't take a lot of damage that put me into the dying state. But I didn't really talk a lot about the fundamental mechanics of Resident Evil Revelations 2 in the first video, so I guess I'll discuss them right now. So, obviously, the enemies don't drop any resources, you have to find the resources yourself, and I also noticed something very odd. So, obviously, since this is a no healing walkthrough, I don't see a need for green herbs. But I was getting a lot of situations where I was looting crates, but they were dropping nothing but green herbs, which is a massive inconvenience for this walkthrough, because I assume the reason why I was getting so many green herbs is because the developers want you to have green herbs in your inventory, or they probably assumed that because I didn't have green herbs in my inventory, I was playing the game wrong, or I was just spamming healing items like crazy, which is what I wasn't doing. I was just choosing not to bring them along with me. So it's almost like the developers set up this whole system with the idea that people are always going to have green herbs in their inventory. So to accommodate for this, they make it where if you don't have a lot of green herbs in your inventory, they increase the chances of getting green herbs from crates, which is what it was in my case. Like that shiny object right there, that's a green herb. And I have no green herbs in my inventory, so it must mean that because I don't have any green herbs in my inventory, I'm more likely to get green herbs in the environment, which is going to suck. Because I think some of these ammo caches also contain ammunition. Like, I think that ammo cache that I looked at just then was 5 pistol bullets if you had plenty of green herbs. But of course, since I didn't have green herbs, I was going to get a green herb, which is something that is pretty stupid. I mean, I understand that this game does have its problems, and there are just a lot of moments where the enemies can cheat in order to get a cheap hit on you, but do you really have to make it where green herbs are more likely to spawn in, even when I'm not even in the danger state? That is a pretty big inconvenience for a survival horror game when ammunition is a key tenet of survival horror, and I need those ammunition deposits in order to do anything. And that right there, I am amazed that actually worked. So, I mentioned before in the first episode of this walkthrough that there's an exploit you can do in Claire 2 and Claire 3, where when you go through doors, you can actually sneak attack enemies. Because what happens is, when you're in the middle of the animation, and a couple of seconds after you finish the animation of going through doors, the enemies aren't doing anything. They don't even react to you when you stand right in front of them, because they're stuck in the stealth profile during those specific sections, and it's only those sections. But apparently, in that case right over there, the enemy was aware of me when I went through the door, and I was still in the middle of the animation, but luckily I went right through him, because that animation that he's doing right now, where he's walking towards me with his arms up, that is a grab animation. It is a moving active frame period the entire time, just like with Resident Evil 6. Only compared to Resident Evil 6, the Rotten on this game, which is what they're called, they prolong that animation for way longer than in Resident Evil 6, and they only stop it when you actually get behind them. And that is definitely something you're going to have to bear in mind with the Rotten. Don't just go charging in like crazy, because they will catch you very easily with that grab animation, because it's just a moving grab animation the whole entire time. And that is something I need to talk about as well. So, the Rotten on this game, they reuse a lot of the animations from the zombies in Resident Evil 6 on Leon's campaign, and Ether calls this a bad thing. I mean, it's not really something you're supposed to call a good thing or a bad thing, though. It's just a very neutral thing. I mean, a lot of games do this, where in the later games, they tend to reuse attack animations that they used in previous games, but we don't think anything of that when we're playing through good games. We don't really think of anything of that when we're doing bad games. So that's a very odd thing to be mad about. I mean, It's good in a sense because I understand the moveset of the zombies from Resident Evil 6 very well. So because of the familiar moveset, I'm able to understand how to actually punish those moves. So that's not really a bad thing, but at the same time, it's not really a good thing. But again, there's no reason to call it a good thing or a bad thing. It's just don't think about it. If they reuse an animation, so what? I mean, they did this with a lot of other Resident Evil games. I mean, the flinch animations on Resident Evil 5 are very similar to the flinch animations from Resident Evil 4. And there are a couple of animations that are reused in Resident Evil 6 from Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5, but we don't think anything of that. I mean, it's not to that major of a degree, though. So I don't really care at all that the Rotten reuse animations from Resident Evil 6. But just to continue on this discussion on the mechanics of Revelations 2, this game, they reintroduced the whole ability to punish flinch animations with an animation, only you have to do it during very specific stun animations, obviously, and this game doesn't have traditional stun mechanics like in Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6. The stuns are dependent upon arbitrary damage values, basically, so when you're aiming for weak spots, you need to deal a certain amount of damage to that weak spot to put the enemies into an animation that you can punish with a melee attack as the main character. And there are certain animations that don't require this, like for instance, when the enemies are on the ground and they're crawling, or when they're recovering from being knocked down, you can punish them using a follow-up attack on your side characters. You don't have to purchase an upgrade for this, so Moira can use her crowbar to finish off enemies on the ground, and Natalia can use her brick to finish off enemies on the ground. If you purchase the follow-up attack in the skills menu, that means the main characters can use it. And this is important for Barry 1 because a lot of the situations where you're dealing with the Rotten, they can be on the ground. And one of the most important strategies for dealing with the Rotten is to use Natalia's brick to knock them over because it's a guaranteed stun on them, and then you can just finish them off using the follow-up attack on Barry's knife if you have the ability, which is what you always want to do before you get into Barry 1. However, what you need to bear in mind about the Rotten is whenever they go into the attack animation where they're on the ground and they just swipe at you, you cannot punish that animation. You have to wait until they go back into a neutral state before you can punish them with the follow-up attack, which is pretty dumb, and you have to pretty much space them out in order to make sure that the prompt doesn't disappear at a bad moment. But it's not that big of a deal. Just make sure you bear that in mind and you'll be fine. But Natalia's bricks, they are preset in the environment, but you can't take them through doors for whatever reason. And I understand why, but I just wish the justification was a lot better. Like, you go through doors with so many items and many other games that you just pick up from a previous room, and you're just able to take it with you, but this game doesn't let you do that, which is pretty silly. And again, it's for balancing, because they don't want you to be too reliant upon Natalia's bricks. And, they want the encounters to flow a certain way based on the number of bricks in a certain room. But just make your justification better. I mean, you've been able to take items with you in your inventory system. Like, why can't you place the brick in your inventory system? I mean, that just makes a lot more sense. But I guess that kind of sense didn't apply when they were actually designing the brick system on this game. But this part of Barry 1 is very simple. It's when we get to the Revenants that there's a slight difficulty adjustment, but still not that hard. Because, again, Natalia's bricks are very powerful at actually knocking over enemies. And you can actually upgrade the damage on their bricks as well, so that you'll be able to kill enemies very quickly with the bricks. This is especially handy when dealing with Glasps, which are an enemy type that you encounter later on in the later episodes of Barry's campaign, and also in Claire 4. But I'll talk about those enemies when I get the chance, when they're actually introduced. But having Natalia's brick be upgraded, as well as Moira's crossbar, it can be very helpful in actually balancing out this game to ensure that the enemies aren't cheesing you, and you can just be very reliant upon the side characters and save up on a lot of ammunition. And it's good as well that the side characters are overpowered, because then it makes a lot more sense if the bosses are going to take a huge beating before they go down. And at times, it still doesn't feel like you have the ammunition necessary to deal with the bosses. Like, Alex Wesker, I've already talked about how shit Alex Wesker is, but there are just times when you run out of ammo very quickly against Alex Wesker, and instead you're having to be very reliant upon your knife and on Alex Wesker's ability to track your hitbox through the geometry, so she tries to swipe at you through the geometry, which is a problem with this game. The enemies can attack you through the geometry on this game, and this game doesn't have the whole system that Resident Evil 7 had, where the enemies are incapable of reading your hitbox through walls. They unfortunately didn't include this in Resident Evil Village, so you get a lot of moments in Resident Evil Village where the enemies can actually track your hitbox through walls, so it's like they're trying to attack you through the wall, but they don't have the ability to hit you through the geometry. I mean, the only exception in this case is Aureus, because Aureus is broken, because he can hit you through pillars with his hammer when he does his slam attack, and it's bullshit. Oh, and that right there, if you didn't use the fire trap in Claire 1, you have a free path to actually get out of there. That right there is one of the moments where I can really appreciate this live selection system, where it actually makes a significant difference in progress later on in a later episode. But there are times where the live selection doesn't feel like it has a lot of impact in later areas of Revelations 2. And it was kind of the same case with Resident Evil 3 as well, which I've already discussed. But yeah, that's just how I feel. You might feel differently about it, but I'll just stick to what I know. But we've just done that whole entire section with the Rotten, and now we're going to be dealing with Revenants. This is the reintroduction of Ouroboros. So Ouroboros was the virus that was used in Resident Evil 5 that was used to reanimate corpses into tentacle POWs. And in this case, the Ouroboros mutation, or virus in this case, was actually implanted into dead bodies, and the dead bodies were outfitted with certain weapons to create this amalgamation known as the Revenant. And the Revenants are pretty bullshit in this game because they have the ability to move at a speed that is way faster than your sprint if you're trying to run away from them. So they will run at light speed in order to catch you. And also, they can move about very awkwardly whenever their weak spots are exposed. And you have to rely upon Natalia to know exactly what the weak spot is. Only the good news is the weak spots on each of the Revenants is always the same. I think that's always the case. There's no Revenant with a random weak spot. The weak spots are always in the same location, so as long as you commit those to memory, you shouldn't have to be so reliant upon Natalia. And this is really strange as well. She says, "What's that?" So she can clearly see the Revenant, but then she's like, "Where is it?" So she didn't see it moving into the ceiling. That is pretty silly. But you have to look at the ceiling in order to get this guy to spawn. If you interact with the door as Barry while that guy is in the ceiling, he will teleport right behind you and just catch you very quickly because he's very close to you. But this first guy, he has a little bit more life than the actual Revenants that you encounter later on in this episode, because I noticed that this guy takes a little bit more of a beating from the pistol rounds before he goes down. At least it's not to an absurd degree like in Revelations 1. Like, what was the whole point in giving that ooze that you encounter when you trigger that cutscene that much life on Infernal difficulty? And the thing is that I even went to normal difficulty and I got to that part, but that guy has the same amount of health that you would be encountering with the normal ooze. So why did they change it with that one ooze in the kitchen area when you finally get to that part in episode 1 of Revelations 1? Like, what purpose does it serve? It's almost like in Resident Evil 6 as well, where you encounter those Napods in Chapter 2 of Chris's campaign, and they have way more life, and I get that they're slightly bigger variants of the Napods, so maybe that's what justifies their increased life, but still, though, you then have the Gnezdo, like the first Gnezdo you encounter in Chapter 3 of Chris's campaign, but it has the same amount of life as the other Gnezdo that you encounter, so why is there this flip-flopping of mentalities? You have one mentality that favors the introduction of an enemy type through an absurd HP pool, and then later on they have less HP that actually feels realistic. And then you have another mentality that doesn't bother with all that. It's so confusing. Oh, and right here, you'll notice that my flashlight is on, and then this guy just turns around. So this is when I contemplated restarting, but then I realized it's a no healing walkthrough. So try to make sure that your flashlight is off, although I'm almost certain that I don't recall the flashlight ever playing a role in the stealth when I was playing as Barry in my earlier playthroughs of Revelations 2, so why it was different in this case, I don't know, but just keep your flashlight off just in case. But this is an encounter that gives the impression that you're supposed to stealth it, and it does really come across as such, and it is intimidating in that sense. And I humor the game in that regard, because I do like it for that. But given that I just messed up right there, and given that the actual spawning of these Revenants is all dependent upon Natalia's ability to see them, and then there are times where you take the wrong path and Revenants just run towards you, even when you're in a stealth profile, like they know where you are. And there are Revenants in the treetops as well, which you have to spot as Natalia, so you have to make sure you don't take the wrong path. But at this point, I'm just going to rely upon this, where I'm going to keep the Revenants on camera in order to slow them down. And then once I'm actually close enough to the door, I'm going to sprint, because right now, the Revenants can run at light speed and catch up to me, because they do this animation that isn't representative of the actual movement animation that they're doing. It's like they're gliding. It's like with Traeger from Outlast, where when you look at his walking animation, the speed at which he's moving does not complement the speed at which his legs are moving, so it's like he's gliding when he's actually walking, and it's very similar to that, where the Revenants get a lot of light speed, but their movement animation doesn't look correct, like with the Lickers from Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake. So, yeah, that is pretty annoying, but I get the whole purpose of it. I just wish the implementation was a lot better. But one thing that I am glad about this game is that you don't encounter so many enemies in single rooms compared to Revelations 1. In Revelations 1, they put in scenarios where you were dealing with a lot of enemies, and sometimes it worked out really well, like in Episode 5 when you were playing as Grinder, and you were dealing with those Farfarello at the crash site of that Veltro plane. And it works out really well, but then you have situations like in Episode 7 of Revelations 1 where there are so many enemies, and the game even resorts to spawning enemies out of thin air, and the stun systems and the actual weapon systems of Revelations 1 can at times not feel complementary to that whole system, and if you don't have pulse grenades for that sequence, you are going to mess up so many times. And it's probably due to the fact that on Revelations 1, healing items were quite accessible because you had the ability to scan enemies and actually contribute to a healing item. But I just feel like they let that whole mentality of healing items just bleed into the actual gameplay, and that's why at times the balancing in Revelations 1 can be very atrocious. Same with Revelations 2. You get a lot of healing items, and because you get a lot of healing items, this gives the developers more leeway to just be very lazy with their designs, which is what leads to more poor designs. There's a reason why I say no damage is an important factor to consider, not because of the fact that you're treating it like any other run, like a kill-all run. No damage has importance because it actually affects the actual design process and the actual designs that get put into the game. When the developers are designing their games for no damage in mind, they have to put more of a leash on their creativity so that they're not being so overwhelming with their designs to the point where it's going to suffer so much with the gameplay. That's what I mean when I say no damage is important to deliver functional gameplay. And right here, we are being introduced to the firebomb bottles. So I skip those two enemies, and then I just craft another firebomb bottle. I'm going to use one firebomb bottle on these two revenants over here. And you have to wait a little bit. They're currently invulnerable during this animation. I mean, the guy on the left will recover very quickly, but this guy, you gotta wait a little bit. And as long as you keep your distance, that guy on the left shouldn't be able to run at you. But one firebomb bottle is enough to actually take out these enemies. That right there is really good design. Imagine if that was Resident Evil Village. In Resident Evil Village, they would probably give you this whole illusion of mechanics actually being useful on the earlier difficulties, and then you go to Village of Shadows difficulty, and those mechanics mean absolutely nothing anymore. Like when they remove the stun animations, I mean, I mentioned before in Revelations 2 that the shotgun actually knocks over enemies on this game. In Resident Evil Village, on hardcore difficulty and the previous difficulties, the shotgun can actually knock over Lycans, and it can knock over the Moriekas as well. But you go to Village of Shadows difficulty, the Lycans are completely resilient to actually being knocked over unless you get a point-blank range shotgun blast on their head, just to get an animation that should have been easily accessible had you actually shot them at center mass. And with the Moriekas, it takes 2 shotgun shells to knock them over, which at that point just feels like no flinch animations whatsoever. Like, what were they trying to accomplish with that? There is no thought put into Village of Shadows difficulty's design philosophies. And when a developer tries to sacrifice designs like that on the highest difficulty, it shows what they truly value. It shows that for Village of Shadows difficulty on Resident Evil Village, they value poor designs, they value bare bones designs, they value lazy designs, they don't value actual fundamental gameplay that is crucial to overall gameplay balance. And at least with Revelations 2, they maintained a better mentality towards mechanics compared to Resident Evil Village. And it seriously sickens me that this team that made Resident Evil Village could make such a huge blunder on that game, gameplay-wise. And then you have idiots, like some people who commented on the very first walkthrough that I ever did for Resident Evil Village, saying that Village of Shadows difficulty is a phenomenal difficulty, and they actually enjoyed it, not understanding when you're supposed to actually judge something from a challenging perspective, and they completely blur the line between an actual challenging and functional experience and a poorly designed game. You There are so many people that feel that a poorly designed game is a challenging experience, but that just goes to show how incapable they are at comprehending the English language if they are using those terminologies as flippantly. It's fucking retarded, and I hate those people so much, and that's just the kind of fan base that New Capcom wanted to favor with Resident Evil Village. And with Revelations 2, it's hard to tell what fan base they were trying to satisfy. I mean, I get they were trying to satisfy the old school survival horror fans, and also they were trying to satisfy the people that love Resident Evil 4 and onward. But there are just times in Revelations 2 where the mentalities are kind of poorly communicated, or they mismatch in an incorrect format when you get to certain parts of Revelations 2. And you don't notice it as much in episode 1, because episode 1 flows nicely, but the episodes afterwards, there are a lot of sequences that you really have to question what the hell the developers were thinking. But I guarantee you guys, it's not to a degree like what you'd be questioning with Resident Evil Village's development team. And I still consider to this day that Resident Evil Village's development team is the dumbest development team and the most deluded and downright arrogant development team I have ever seen for a Resident Evil game. But that's not to say they couldn't deliver any substantial content, because I am so attached to Ethan Winters. I am so attached to the other characters there. I am so attached to the music. Like, Ethan Winters is more enjoyable than every single older Resident Evil character. Like, just playing through this game and just playing as the older Resident Evil characters, it didn't feel right. Like, playing as Claire, playing as Barry, they just don't achieve the same level of emotional impact like I did with Ethan Winters. Like, Ethan Winters, there's just something about him, like just the way he was presented in Resident Evil 7 and in Resident Evil Village. There is something about the way he was presented in those games that is so different to the way the older Resident Evil characters were portrayed in their games, and maybe it was just the tone of those games, but there is definitely something magical about the way Ethan Winters was introduced, and I'll never stop feeling it to this day. And that's why I just can't feel attached to these characters anymore. I mean, I can feel attached to Chris Redfield a bit, minus the fact that they ruined him in Resident Evil Village. I can still feel attached a bit to Leon, but it's to a minor degree with those characters compared to Ethan Winters, just with how unique he is compared to the other Resident Evil characters. And Barry and Claire don't really feel that unique from the other Resident Evil characters. That's just what makes him so magical of a character, and I love it so much in Resident Evil 7 and in Resident Evil Village. But that is the end of Barry 1. Like I said, a very simple episode because, of course, it's the beginning of the game. It has to be simple, but it's a nice introduction, and it really gives you hope that Revelations 2 will actually be better, but it definitely falls flat in a lot of regards to the later episodes of Revelations 2. But stay tuned for the future episodes. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.